Good morning or good evening or good afternoon, whenever you're listening to this. It's morning here. Snowy Monday morning. Just had a huge snowstorm with about 10 inches of snow, so we have a snow day. So I figured great time to do a podcast and get ahead of the game. I've been trying to stay ahead of these because for a while there it was basically me recording them the day of, which puts a little bit of added pressure. So moving ahead with this one, what we're going to do is talk a bit about one of my favorite genera of tarantulas, Poecilotheria or Poecilotheria. I will say it both ways because I know it tends to irritate people when I say the Poecilotheria, but that was how I was taught it was said. Although I will obviously concede that the Latin names are much debated amongst even people who supposedly majored in Latin. There's a lot of arguments on my YouTube videos, particularly as people come on and start arguing, well, I took Latin and it's pronounced this way, and I took Latin and it was pronounced this way, and if you use medical Latin, it's this way, and if you sign, I honestly don't know. The problem with the names, the binomial names, I love them, but I think they're more meant to be written, not so much spoken. So anyway, whatever you want to call it, the Pokies. We'll go Pokies. And one of the things I've been shying away from is repeating anything in the podcast that I've already done in videos, because at that point I was figuring that the majority of my audience were folks coming over from my videos, so they've seen it all before, so I didn't want to repeat myself. It was kind of a different avenue. I wanted to do something different with it. But however, what's come to my attention recently is that now people are just listening to the podcast and not watching the videos and vice versa, which is great because it means I'm hitting two different target audiences, people that aren't able to sit down and spend all the time watching the videos or want to put something on for background noise like the podcast, so they're not necessarily seeing all the videos. So with that in mind, it's okay to go back and cover some of the topics that I've covered in the videos before, and one of my favorites was not too far long ago, maybe last year and a half or so, I did a video on genus Poecilotheria because I love them. They're easily, if I had to narrow it down to one genus of spider that I would keep, it would probably be Poecilotheria. This would be a really tough one for me, honestly, but they're just, I don't know, there's like tarantulas and then there's Poecilotheria in some ways. I find them to be very regal. I love the look of them. They're very streamlined and lithe, and just the colorations on them. I know everybody loves the blue ones. And of course, we have Poecilotheria metallica, but my Rufulatus, for example, with those greens, just stunning. The Vittatas and the Regalis, I still think Regalis is some of the most beautiful tarantulas out there. I just love the fractile pattern on them. Just gorgeous spiders, and spiders that I feel like really get demonized a bit in the hobby. And I think part of it is due to the fact that as hobbyists, we're always concerned that one big bite or one prolific bite that makes the papers, God forbid somebody picks one of these up, it escapes and injures, a child, or somebody ends up in the emergency room and it just happens to catch local news, and next thing you know it, you've got one of these exposés about people keeping deadly tarantulas in their homes. And it sounds far-fetched to a point until you realize it could honestly happen. It's happened with other animals. I live in a state where we had we'll call it a chimp attack, where somebody was attacked by a pet chimp. And the fallout from that was legislators scrambling to basically ban anything they perceived to be a threat to the populace. So what started off as, all right, no more keeping primates, soon turned into ferrets were on the list, snakes were on the list, arachnids were on the list. They just basically started covering any animal that wasn't essentially a dog or cat or a hamster. So it seems far-fetched that somebody would get bitten by one of these and suddenly the hobby there would be a huge crackdown, but it's something that's conceivable as far as I'm concerned. Super realistic? Probably not. And I do point to the fact that people have been keeping tarantulas now for decades. They've risen more, I think, in the last 20 years or so in popularity. More people are keeping them. It's less there used to be a stereotype of the type of people that kept tarantulas, and now I think we're seeing a lot of, I talk to doctors, veterinarians, lawyers, teachers, all kinds of people are picking up these pets. It's not just the fringy folks. And I think since there's a lot of people that don't know to go online and look up good information, there's a lot of folks that don't know the difference between old world and new worlds. To be completely honest, when I first got my first tarantula, 20 something years ago, I had no idea there was a difference between the two. That was something I found out way later on. So I think a lot of people go out there, they say, "Ooh, look at this, a beautiful blue tarantula. What is this? A Goody sapphire ornamental. Ooh, I'm gonna pick up one of these." And they end up getting a spider that they don't know much about. They're been told that their bites are no worse than bee stings. They don't know about old world venom versus new world venom. And I got a funny feeling this happens a lot. We like to, the problem is a bunch of us that are informed and are social, or at least on social media and talking about tarantulas, tend to get together and we talk a lot about them, so we're informed. But I think there's a whole lot more of us out there. I'd say the vast majority are folks that are just in a Petco or in a pet store, see one of these things and go, ooh, P. muticus, what is this? King baboon gets 8 inches. I'm going to pick one of these up, and have no idea what they're getting into. So with that in mind, you would assume that if it was going to happen, somebody would have been bitten by now and it would have made national news. I've heard stories of people that picked up spiders. I was actually talking to a guy not that long ago who emailed, and he said one of his second spiders was a P. metallica, and he decided to handle it, and it didn't go well. And then he got bit a second time, and he said it was miserable, and he had no idea at the point. He thought he had an allergic reaction, didn't find out till years later it wasn't an allergic reaction. Their venom is just that strong. So do I think that there's a possibility that somebody could be bit, it could make news, national news, and cause crackdowns on tarantulas? It's, as my dogs are on the background, it's definitely possible. Is it probable? That's where I think things get a little bit more gray. I don't think so. I think it would have happened by now. However, there's a lot of us that have been in the hobby for a while that don't want to see it ruined. I live in a state where, the animal does the wrong thing, they're going to try to ban it. So I think a lot of us err on the side of caution and try to keep these out of beginners' hands. But what's happening is a lot of beginners go out there, and one of the first tarantulas you see, it was one of the first I saw that they look at and go, this can't possibly be real, is the Poecilotheria metallica, or the Goody sapphire ornamental. A lot of folks, I remember the first time I saw one, I called my wife over. I'm like, check this out. This has to be photoshopped. I was floored when I found out that was actually a real spider. Those seem to be the ones that really attract a lot of attention, and a lot of people see them and go, I can't tell you how many emails and messages I get that, hey, I just got into the hobby. My goal is to eventually own a P. metallica or Goody sapphire ornamental. It seems to be the big spider everybody wants to keep. They're gorgeous. I mean, it's a combination of that beautiful Poecilotheria build with that blue coloration, just really gets people going. So I get a lot of questions from folks asking about Poecilotheria care, and the big one is, when do you think I'll be ready for one of those? And that's something I can't answer, and usually will not attempt to answer. Honestly, I got one kind of early on in my keeping. I do point to the fact that I've been around, and there's people that will argue this ad nauseum and say it's not the same, and I agree to a point, it's not the same. But I grew up on a farm with animals. I've been around animals my entire life. I learned very early on that how to watch animals and watch their movements, watch how they react to things. So I feel very comfortable around them. I spent over a decade with snakes, which again, not the same, but I did do an earlier podcast about how some of the things from the herp hobby can transfer over to tarantulas. So I wasn't coming in just being a kid who just kept a dog, a cat, or a hamster and then picked up tarantulas like, ooh, what are these? I had some experience with other animals. I had some experience with exotics, and I think some of those did translate well. And I tend to be cautious by nature working with any animals. I like studying them, their movements, their patterns, their attitudes. Like, can I pick up something on them when they're going to bolt? Can I pick up something when they might be defensive? It worked for me, and I can't. That's just because I think the way I grew up and having been around animals, it's not for me to tell, John B. off the street, you're ready for one of these or you're not ready for one of these. I've had people that contacted me that said, I think I'm ready and I'm going to get one, and they pick one up, and I hear from them later on and they have like 10 of them and they've done completely fine. I've had other people that have contacted me and said, hey, I picked up a Poecilotheria and I'm so excited. And then the next thing I get is the panicked email a few months down the road. I tried to rehouse it and it got out, and it's I was so scared. But that's where you have to kind of figure out where you're at. So I don't generally wade into that one. I just, in my inbox this morning, had an email from somebody saying they've kept for 6 months. They love Poecilotheria. They want a P. metallica. Can I keep it? And my answer was, it's kind of up to you. If you feel ready. And again, I always point to the fact that think about the rehousing. That's the part where most of the bad things can happen. And think about, is it going to be something where you're going to panic? When you think about rehousing, do you get the cold sweats? I've had somebody actually say they've had nightmares over it. In that case, you're probably not ready, because, again, you have to be cautious. You have to be respectful. But I think fear is one of those emotions that if you get to the point where you're terrified of them, you're afraid of them. I had people say that they're looking for, special gloves so they can't be bit. They're putting up full suits. Then you're going to make mistakes if something does happen. However, However, back to my original point, as we're going in, because I know somebody's going to ask, hey, it's going to be in the comment section. I just got my first tarantula. When do you think I'll be ready? That's up to you. I will say that I do think these guys are demonized, back to my original point, because we're always worried about the what ifs. And with Poecilotheria, they're known to have nasty bites. When they give you a wet bite, it's known to be nasty, excruciating localized pain, full body cramping that I've heard from people that said they would get episodes up to a year after the actual bite. People have ended up in the emergency room with heart palpitations, with feeling like their chest was seizing up because it attacks all the muscles. This is no joke. This is something I don't want to get bit by. I've had people come on and go, oh, just pick it up. What are you, a wuss? No, I'm not an idiot. I don't want years of, or possibly a year of bad reactions to venom bites or debilitating full body cramping because I was a knucklehead. That just doesn't make any sense to me. So I do think that part of the demonization of these guys, of this genus, is due to the fact of the what if. What if some guy picks one of these up, isn't ready, is showing his friends, and somebody gets bit, he gets sued, it makes the papers, and next thing you know, they're banning these deadly tarantulas that can kill somebody. And again, we joke about the deadly part, but I did just review a book in which somebody referred to them as deadly and that they can kill you, so that it's not far-fetched to believe. Unfortunately, because of this demonization, I use the term demonization, I don't use it lightly. I've seen folks on forums and stuff really talk about how vicious they are and they're aggressive. I hate that term. And again, probably my biggest pet peeve in the hobby. They're not aggressive, but aggressive, they'll kill you, whatever. And I think that, although obviously well-intentioned, really creates an unrealistic picture of what these spiders are about. So in this podcast, basically what I'm going to do is talk about some of the basic care of them, talk about what I think some of the best beginner pokies are, and believe me, people can chime in because everybody's going to have a different take. Talk about, I think, two that probably people should avoid if they're just getting into pokies. I mean, there kind of are beginner pokies, and there are the ones that you might want to shy away from a little bit due to the size and the fact they're a little more skittish, and then talk about the reality about their temperaments. So first and foremost, what I found with mine is that slings can be quite skittish. That can't be, understated. They're very, very fast. When they get spooked, and if they get spooked, they move very quickly, will bolt generally around the enclosure. They can be up and out before you can get the top back on. So that's something to be aware of. But granted, I've never received a threat posture from slings, and I think I counted up, I've raised about 3 dozen pokey slings over the years. Never gotten a threat posture out of them. Never seen anything that I wouldn't even call them particularly defensive at that size. And then one thing that needs to be stated is most small spiderlings from the Poecilotheria genus will burrow for quite a while. So that's something to think of when you're setting them up. So for my slings, the quintessential 32-ounce deli cup generally works great for all slings. They start off, they're fairly hefty size slings even when they first start out. And I find I put a couple inches of moist substrate in, some peat moss, cork bark leaned across at a diagonal, so usually a cork bark flat leaned diagonally across. And what they will do is they will go behind that cork bark, they will burrow a little bit, they will make some dirt curtains, which is basically they put out webbing, they pull some of the substrate and the sphagnum and they fill it all up and they make themselves nice little hidey areas, and they will usually stay this way until they hit about 3 to 4 inches or so. Then you start seeing them out more. So that's something I think I get some emails sometimes. Hey, I got Poecilotheria, I set it up, a little sling, set it up arboreally, and I never see it and I'm really concerned. No, that's normal. They will burrow. That's something they've seen in the wild. They will hide when they're smaller. Sometimes in the crooks of trees, they make their little areas, and that's where they stay. And they tend to be more shy than anything else. That's going to be the recurrent theme in this one. Is that Poecilotheria, they're shy. They don't like being spotted out in the open. They have amazing, fantastic natural camouflage with those patterns on them, especially if you use a certain color cork bark in there, and certain species will blend right into that cork bark. So a lot of them, especially when they get older, they're not about bolting or fighting, they're about flattening themselves out and trying to blend in with their surroundings. So that's, I think, an important thing that gets overlooked sometimes. Some species, they get caught out, they're going to start throwing up the threat posture. In OBT, for example, if you rip open the top of the enclosure, disturb the webbing, and it's out, it's going to stand its ground. The pokies, generally from what I've seen, especially the slings will bolt to their little burrows, you won't even see them. The adults will scuttle behind their cork bark, into their cork bark if you're using cork bark tubes, or flatten themselves out so that hopefully you pass them up and don't see them. They're generally not going to stand and fight, and unless you spook them, they're not going to bolt. Now, I do keep my slings moist, so that's one thing. And until they hit about the 3.5 inch marks, I'm pretty careful about making sure the substrate stays moist. I will try to give them water dishes, but they tend to web them and fill them with dirt, so just a heads up there. Slings tend to be excellent eaters. This is a great species as far as eating. You drop a cricket in it or a roach in, they grab it very quickly, and I found they grow very well depending on the species. Now, I've talked to some people that have reported differently, but my Poecilotheria metallica has been by far my slowest grower, at least the one I kept separately. That one took quite some time to reach the 3-inch mark, where most of my other specimens, I had a regalis hit 4 or 5 inches in a year. I've had males molt out with about 16 months or so. So they're generally a fast growing spider, which is something to keep in mind when you're getting ready to do the inevitable rehousings, and something to keep in mind when you're trying to figure out how many rehousings you're going to have to do. And I'll give you a tip on that in a moment. But the P. metallica, the one I kept separately, one of my slower growing ones. The Hanemophilus amicas were fairly slow growing. One thing I can mention about the P. metallicas is I do have a communal setup with 10 of them now, and some of the specimens in that setup are growing very, very quickly. 2 just hit the 3-inch mark. I don't think it's even been a year yet. So I found that when they were kept together, the ones kept together, most of them grew a lot more quickly, where a few of them were growing about the speed as my first one did, maybe even slower. So something interesting to keep in mind, and maybe folks that kept other Poecilotheria communals can kind of chime in if they've noticed anything different as far as the growth rate. But overall, fast-growing spider. The little slings will start off eating small crickets, small roaches, but once they molt a couple times, they can take down fairly good-sized ones. I've actually had my P. regalis used to be a relentless hunter, and when she hit about 2 inches or so, I'd just drop in a full large cricket and she'd take it down no problem. And as slings, I always feed my slings usually twice a week or so, every 2 or 3 days, depending. And usually the pre-molt period isn't particularly long. They'll bury themselves. You won't see them for a while. And next thing you know it, they're usually good enough to take their old molts and bring them out. And that's kind of your heads up that they're ready to start eating again. Now, again, as we mentioned, most of them grow very, very quickly, so it's not going to be long before you have a 3.5 inch, and they tend to go for about 1 minute they look like, comfortably a juvenile at 2.5 inches. Next minute you have like a 3.5 inch spider. There's one molt in particular where they put on a pretty good amount of size, and that's usually when it's time to move them out. Now, some of them end up in a 32-ounce deli container. I usually keep them until they hit that 3.5 inch point. There seems to be one molt where they're like just a bit too big for the container, and then they're really too big for the container. And that's usually the point where I look to rehouse them. Now, I think this is one of the species, and I've talked a lot about putting smaller slings in adult enclosures, or putting small spiders in giant enclosures, and why sometimes I think it's not the best for the spider. I know people argue, well, it doesn't bother the spider, it's all to make things more convenient for us. Well, it's to make the care of the spider more convenient for us, so we can keep track and make sure it's getting the correct care. I just want to throw that out there. But usually when they hit about the 3.5 inch mark, that's where you can put them into their adult enclosures. They're big enough, they are active hunters, and to compare them to another arboreal species or another arboreal genus, the Avicularia I've found do better when they're in smaller enclosures. I've had some that will basically web right up. If you give them a big enclosure, they'll web right up at the top, and they don't necessarily come down to hunt. Poecilotheria, on the other hand, will come down to hunt. They will be along the bottom. They will catch things, no problem. Sense them, they go down and grab them. There's not an issue. So putting a 3.5 inch juvenile in a 5-gallon setup, or even a larger setup, I've not found it to be a problem. Now, for quite some time, for my adult Poecilotherias, I used Sterilite containers are around 28 to 30 liters or so. Just the bigger bins, not the huge bins. And for me, it was more about, I like top-loading enclosures when working with Poecilotheria, because one tip I will give you is that when they do get spooked, they tend to circle. I have some species that will go crazy and go right up and out before you can blink. Poecilotheria tend to circle the enclosure. So if you have a front opening enclosure and they get spooked, they could be coming right out at you. You could have the old pokey cannon. So that's just my preference. It's not wrong to put them in something that opens from the front. I want to make that very, very clear. It's just when I work with them, I like a lot of room from the top. So God forbid one does bolt over the side, my hands aren't in the way of it. But now I'm starting to put them in nicer enclosures. So for a while, I've used the extra large critter keepers. Work great. They're offer a lot of open room in the top. If you pop the top off, they're crystal clear. If you take a Dremel tool. You can easily add some more cross ventilation. So I kind of like those. However, now I'm eyeing some of the Exoterras. Now that I've been doing some of the bioactive enclosures, I'm looking at getting my Pokies into some prettier digs. And one of the ones I'm looking at is a 12 by 12 by 18 inch Exoterras. We'll see how that goes. They're a little more pricey, but they look pretty. And if you want to put in some live plants or whatnot, that would be another alternative. Another popular thing, old Rob C., tarantula guy, used to use the 10-gallon and 5-gallon tanks, the regular fish tanks, stand them up on their sides and make plexiglass fronts for them. A lot of people prefer them, but something around the 5 to 10-gallon size. And for some of the bigger species, you're going to want to lead more toward 10-gallon. For some of the smaller ones, you can get away with a 5-gallon. I've talked to many people that keep them in the Exoterra Nano Talls, the 8 by 8 by 12-inch ones. I did originally have my Poecilotheria Metallica in one of those when I first got her. She was about 3 inches and it was great. But when she started putting on some size, it just seemed, when she hit around the 7-inch mark, it just seemed a bit cramped for me. So I ended up moving her into something larger. But there are people that use those, and you could probably get away with that for some of the smaller specimens. P. Metallica, for example, doesn't get huge. That might do well in one. The main thing is, though, to give them some room and make sure you have room to work. Now, again, temperament-wise, once they get to be adults, I found the majority of mine are quite calm. When you open the top of the enclosure, one trick I have for people is when you go to feed them, tap the enclosure, move the enclosure around a little bit. You'll usually see them either, calmly climb behind the cork bark or into their cork bark to hide, or they just kind of flatten themselves out. That's them trying to hide. They're not going to mess with you because as far as they know, they're camouflage. You can't see them, so they'll sit there calmly. And then just be careful when you work. When you're taking out boluses and stuff, make sure that they're on the opposite side of the enclosure, not near you. When you clean out the water bowl, same thing. Adults or juveniles will easily take large crickets. Juveniles, I usually start dropping the large crickets and once they hit about 3-inch mark. So at that point, you can feed them once a week, whatever your feeding schedule is. You can probably get away with every other week, not a big deal. Adults, same thing. Now, this is one of the genera of tarantulas that for years were thought to be heavily moisture dependent. And if you read a lot of the old literature on them and care sheets, I hate to use care sheets, but a lot of them would talk about keeping the humidity way up. I found that they're very, very adaptable. And if you look at some of the regions they come from and some of the places they are indigenous to, you will find that there are times where things are very, very hot and humid, and then times where they have droughts where it's very, very dry. So they seem to be very adaptable. Now, I find my juveniles, I do keep part of the substrate moist. Once they get to be adults in the summertime, I let things dry out completely. I live in a state where it gets very, very humid. We're talking humidity sometimes the 80s, 90s, usually doesn't drop too low. So a nice big water dish is enough. If I moisten down the substrate and we have one of those 90% humidity days, it's going to be overkill for them. So and during the summer months, not such an issue. During the winter months, right now, I do have a humidifier running in my tarantula room, and it keeps humidity right around the 40-50% mark. During the wintertime, I do find it benefits them to have a moist corner. What I've done is basically when I take them down to feed them once a week or so, I have a thing, that watering jug I use and make it rain, and I soak down a good quarter of the substrate to give them a moist spot. And I have noticed that some of them, when it gets particularly dry, will hover around that area or their water dish. So again, I think they can dry out a bit in the summer. I think even the winter, if it were to dry out a bit, they're still going to be okay, but they do appreciate every once in a while a moist spot in the corner. I think it's just at that point when the air dries out to a point where if you have a furnace running, especially if you don't have a humidifier, the humidity in your home can get quite low. So that's a spot where you want to add a little extra in there. Of course, using a large water dish would also benefit them, but they are a lot more durable and adaptable than we originally gave them credit for. And most of them, if it dries out a bit, are going to be perfectly fine. Now, when I first began shopping around for Poecilotheria species, one of the things that turned me off is the care sheets that I was looking at. Some of the stuff I was reading was talking about how they needed high temperatures. I heard many people tell me that, hey, I want to get one of these, but my tarantula room is only about mid-70s. I know they need like 80 or higher. And again, they are adaptable. They do not need high temperatures. We can throw those temperature requirements right out the window. Mine have done great all the way down to like when I first got my first one. I think my tarantula room would dip into into the mid 60s. She's still ate. She's still molted. She did perfectly fine. I do not find that they require higher temperatures. So if you're keeping them at room temperature, I would say anything right around the 70 mark is perfect. If it hits up to 80, they're still fine. They're one of the species that seems to do well when it gets a little bit warmer, but they do not require extra heat. So that seems to be one of the big misconceptions I get about them. And people asking me about their care, there's a lot of concern about the quote-unquote high humidity requirements for them and high temperatures, and that's not true. You can forget both of those. Do they like a little moisture? Yes, especially as slings. Juveniles, keep them moist, keep a water dish in there. Adults, give them a water dish, moisten down a quarter during the winter. If you get high humidity, don't bother moistening the substrate. It's overkill. And for temperatures, your normal house temperatures will be just fine. Adults, like their little counterparts, their slings and juveniles, are excellent eaters. I feed mine anything from crickets to red runner roaches, red runners, right? I always tend to slip and say red racers. Dubia roaches work great, but I would crush the heads first or else they hide and they don't find them. Another thing I've used before is hissing cockroaches because they will climb, which makes them a good target for them. And they do get quite hefty. Some of these specimens or species will get to be 6-7 inches easily, with other ones like Poecilotheria ornata and Poecilotheria rufilata hitting the 9, possibly 10-inch mark. Now, a lot of people will ask about beginner pokey species. In my opinion, in my experience, so other people's may vary, I find that the best two to start with would be Poecilotheria vittata or Poecilotheria regalis. Keep in mind, the slings will be skittish. You can't get away with that. Most slings are skittish, but they will usually hide. But I found once they hit the juvenile size, they're fairly laid back. My vittata, once they hit, I have two new ones that I raised as slings because unfortunately I lost my big female, I believe last year, a couple of years ago. And once they hit around the 3.5-inch mark, now when I open up their enclosure, they just kind of calmly go behind the cork bark and hide. They're rather laid back. My regalis has always been very laid back. Even the male I had when it matured was rather laid back and not particularly skittish. I will say I had Poecilotheria smithi. They tend to be a little bit more pricey, but I've had two of those and both were very, very calm. The male particularly was ridiculously laid back and docile, and I don't hold these. I would never hold them, but if ever there was one I thought of, like in the back of my mind, where I could almost see this happening, it would have been him. Now, for the record, I would never hold a pokey just because it's not worth the risk or the escape, and I have animals and kids and a very understanding wife, and I don't want to jeopardize any of that, but just to give you the level of how comfortable I was working around this guy. And the female I have is kind of the same way now. She's very, very laid back. This is one I picked up from a pet store a couple summers ago, and she's very calm. When you open the container, she just kind of sits there. So those would be ones I would recommend as good beginner species. Now, obviously, the one everybody wants to own is Poecilotheria metallica, and that's the one everybody wants to start with. My thing is they're a little bit more pricey than the other specimens or other species of Poecilotheria, and although I've had some really calm ones, I've talked to other people that have ones that are very photosensitive and very skittish. So I guess it sounds like this is one of the species of pokies that could be either one way or the other. So I would put them middle of the road. Mine would have been a beautiful beginner. She grew very slowly. She was very, very calm. And as an adult, I will say she's the only pokey I've ever had strike at me, just a little heads up there, where I was trying to take a picture of her and the flash spooked her, and I actually have somewhere footage of her striking it. It was a dumb moment for me, and I got very careless and could have been bitten. Although, looking back at the video, her fangs were out. It was more of a slap. But just something to keep in mind. But that's one of the species everybody wants, and I wouldn't normally tell people to start with them. They can be a little more finicky, a little more slower growing, and the temperaments can be a little less predictable. Now, the two species I usually encourage people, and I'm sure somebody's going to jump out and say, oh, I have one that's a perfect sweetheart. Again, temperaments may vary from specimen to specimen, but overall I found ornatas and rufilatas can be a little more high-strung than some of the other ones. For example, I was feeding my rufilatas the other day, and I opened up the top of one of their enclosures, and one of my females, without warning, started to bolt. And it was like literally, she was sitting there, seemed to be in a good spot. I was reading her body. She was hunkered down, using her camouflage, and then all of a sudden decided to run. And I got the cover on just in time. So something to keep in mind. She said one of them, at least, is a little more flighty. The other one tends to just kind of go underneath her cork bark and you won't see her at all. Same thing with, I have 2 Ornatas now. My first female Ornata was a little bit more high strung, but calmed down as she got older. The 2 younger ones I have now, one is a male, one is likely a female. They are quite skittish at this point, and they're both pushing about 3 inches or so, probably 2.5, 3 inches. So we'll see if that changes any. But other folks have also said that their specimens of Ornata and Rufilata tend to be a little bit more high strung and a little more, I hate to use the word defensive at times. So just something to keep in mind, and considering that they are the largest species of, or 2 of the largest species of Poecilotheria, hitting 9 or even 10 inches. And I have seen a picture of a glorious 10-inch, I believe it was Rufilata. So they do exist. That's a big spider. That's going to be a lot of nasty venom if you happen to get bit. So that's something to keep in mind. Those are 2 I think that you should probably get some experience with keeping other species of pokies before you tackle those. Those are ones I would say are probably better left to advanced keepers. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the spot where you're going to have trouble with them is during rehousings. And I've actually had, knock on wood, really good luck with transferring mine. I do think part of it is to let them know you're coming, so you kind of jostle around the container a little bit, they'll flatten down. And what I've found is you should pull everything out of the enclosure carefully. So you take out the water dish, try to take out that cork bark. And this is, if you're using a cork bark tube, I don't use the tubes as much, but I see a lot of people that use them. You can sometimes just take out the entire tube and move it to the new enclosure. So take a piece of cardboard, cover one end, pick it up, cover the other end, move it into the new enclosure, and you're done. And that's probably the safest way to go. If you're using a cork bark flat, I would remove the flat, and what will happen is a tarantula will usually hunker down in one of the corners by the substrate in the side of the container, and then use the cup method to scoop them up. If you get them in a cup, they tend to calm right down. I think part of it is the cups block the airflow so they don't feel exposed. They feel like they're secure and in a safe spot, and then just move them over, and don't be afraid to leave the cup in there and let them come out on their own. As far as juveniles, we did talk about the fact that you can move right from a sling enclosure to an adult enclosure. For those who want to use a juvenile enclosure, something around a gallon will work. Heads up though, I use the mainstay containers, the mainstay canisters from Walmart for a lot of my juvenile arboreals, and I've stopped using them with Poecilotheria species. And the reason why is because the way they're constructed, they have the round opening at the top, but there are 4 corners because it's kind of the overall shape of the container is almost rectangular. And what'll happen is when you're trying to get the pokies out, they tend to hunker down one of those corners, and it's very difficult to get a brush in there to get them moving again up and out of the container. So I no longer use those. The last ones I use them with, I think, were Vittata. Now I use these large 1 gallon kind of, they're probably 8.5 by 8.5 by 8.5 tall or 9 tall containers that the top comes completely off, and you can basically put them in there and have a lot of room to work. And when you have to get them out, it's incredibly easy. You just open the whole top comes off, you pull out the stuff, you drop your cup over it, you transfer them over. But if you keep calm, I've done a lot of rehousing videos for these guys, and if you keep calm and keep them from becoming spooked, they're generally very easy to move. And that's one of the funny things about these guys. They get such a bad rep that most of them are a lot calmer than, say, Psalmopoeus species or Tapenakinia species. They tend to be more high-strung than Poecilotheria. Those are ones that can be quite defensive. I have my P. armenia that when I was doing some of the cleaning out boluses and cleaning out her water just came charging right out at me to see what was going on. She didn't attack, but you could tell she was hungry and she was coming right out. Where Poecilotheria, I've never seen a Poecilotheria do that. So that's something to keep in mind, that a lot of the stuff you've heard about them, I think the potential is there. You never know. And again, I always try to reiterate that temperaments can differ from specimen to specimen. I might have the calmest Poecilotheria regalis on the planet, and another keeper might report theirs is just a hellion. It really depends on the individual specimen. However, I do think sometimes when we talk to enough keepers about certain species, we can start to kind of develop an overall general idea of what their temperament is like. So let's make that very, very clear, that just because my Vittatas have all been nice, and just because my regalises and my Smithies have all been nice, you could still get a high-strung one. You always got to keep that in mind, so you always need to be cautious. And I think that's the trick with working with Poecilotheria. You don't be scared of them. They're not, it's funny because I put up that Poecilotheria genus review on YouTube, and I was waiting to get some, kickback from people like, oh no, I've heard they're horrible. And it was great to have the keepers that came on. We had a couple people that came on and said they got bit, and usually could basically attribute it to making a mistake on their part. But the majority of keepers are like, I've kept these guys for years and they're amazing. They have such a bad rep. And I think the general consensus for people that keep them is you get in. And I can remember I got my first one of these. I picked up a 3-inch female Vittata, my first Poecilotheria, 3-inch female Vittata from Jamie's. It was one of her, I think, sales. It might have been the Black Friday sale. I'd done all the reading. I kept a couple species. Again, probably jumped in a little earlier than some did, but I was just enamored with these. These were the last tarantulas. I used to be highly arachnophobic. These were the last tarantulas. When I saw pictures of Poecilotheria, that kind of got my heart racing. And I'm like, I got to have one of these. So we picked up one. We put her in an 8x8x12 Exoterra Nano Tall. And then once she put on some size, like she was one of my favorites to go in there and watch. I had so many pictures of her because I was enamored with her. Immediately, it's like, all right, I love this genus of tarantula. And then it came time to rehouse her, and it was me and my son, who's now in his 20s. And if you could have seen us, I mean, I do a lot of rehousing videos now. People can see that, honestly, overall, I'm very, very calm working with these. I normally don't get jacked up. We were so jacked up. We had the whole dinner table cleaned out. The dogs were all out of the house. The kids were all out of the house. It was just me and my son, and we opened up the Exoterra, and we're like holding our breath, and then she ended up coming out right on the doorway. She just kind of moseyed on out. So the door is ajar, completely ajar, and she's standing on the inside of the door, and we're just looking at each other. And then I remember all those reports about these things could jump, and I'm like, oh my God, not scared per se, but more the adrenaline was pumping. The adrenaline was pumping. And we basically I took a cup and put it right over top of her, slid a piece of cardboard off. We put her in the new enclosure and she was perfectly fine. We both looked at each other and laughed like that was it. That was all there was to it. So I think for a lot of people, your first rehousing, the adrenaline's going to go up. You're going to be freaking out a little bit. I think that's totally normal. But hopefully, if you stay calm, plan, if your spider, and this is the best tip I can give you, I don't care how excited you are to get them in their new homes. If you start to do rehousing and the spider flips and starts circling or bolts, put the cover back on, step away for a couple hours, let it relax. Don't bother trying to continue the rehousing if your Poecilotheria species has already become spooked. It's not worth it. That's where there's a potential to get bit. Let them calm back down. You'll find that if you can keep them calm, they are one of the easiest species to rehouse. I know a lot of people are out there probably going, huh? Seriously, I've had better luck with Poecilotheria than I've had with many of my New World, even some of my Brachypelma species, no joke. Again, you always need to keep in the back of your head what they can do to you if something should go wrong. You can't forget that. But I do think that if you keep your calm and you keep the spider calm, rehousings aren't nearly as bad as you think. You don't need, iron gloves or anything, or somebody was buying the gloves I guess you can use you can't cut them with knives and are puncture proof. You should be completely fine with it. So again, amazing spiders. For those of you who are looking to check some out, I would encourage you to start with slings and grow with them. Don't try to avoid. I know a lot of people, and this one kind of bothers me. If you're one of the ones that's like, yeah, I'm going to get a sling, I'm going to drop it in its adult enclosure so I don't have to rehouse it, then you're not ready. There, I'll just say that part. Rehousing is part of keeping spiders. Buying one, a little tiny one, and dropping it in a 10-gallon enclosure just because you're afraid to rehouse it, that means you're not ready for it. You need to be able to do that rehousing. You need to get some practice in. And it's better to practice with them when they're young, a little bit more defensive, than when they're older, and you could have a potential for a nasty bite. So I do encourage people, start with slings. You're going to have a good, if you start them in the 32-ounce deli cup, you're going to have a good probable 8 months to a year in that deli cup, depending on how quickly yours is growing, depending on the feeding schedule, to kind of get the hang of the movements, to kind of witness the fact that they're really kind of shy more than anything. And then when you go to rehouse, then you can drop them right in their adult enclosures. It's appropriate. Make sure you decorate it well, put some fake plants in there. Cork bark, if you use the tubes, again, you can just usually pluck them right out with the tube and drop them in the new enclosures, which is very convenient. And then start with one of the species that most people recognize to be rather laid back, which would be the P. vittata. Again, I've found P. smithii to be laid back. Other people might want to chime in on this, but Regalis and Vittata are generally the most widely, Regalis is going to be the most widely available now because unfortunately Vittata, you can't cross state lines with them, which is incredibly unfortunate. But Regalis might be the one to start with. They're usually readily available on the market. They're quite inexpensive overall. You get slings, raise them up, and again, just be cautious with them. So Again, let's stop with the demonization of them. Do I think beginners should necessarily have them? Again, it depends on the person. More often than not, I say they're not a beginner species. I really feel like in my heart, for many people, they'd be overwhelming, but I've talked to many people that jump right in with them and do fine. You just need to basically make sure your rehousings and your basic husbandry are down pat, because you don't want to be experimenting and making mistakes with something that has the potential to put you in the hospital and make life pretty difficult for several months to a year. Just something to consider. Anyway, that should about do it with this one. Again, thanks so much for listening. If you want to check out the video I did on these guys, the genus review, I'm going to put a link in the description. Hopefully some of you that haven't seen it, check it out, because you get some visuals. You get to see how I go about rehousing them. And again, it's more just a love letter to this genus of tarantulas. I have my website, Tom's Big Spiders. Feel free to check that out. Obviously, my YouTube page. That'll about do it for this one. And again, I always read all the comments. I've been bad about answering them. I haven't been on Facebook all that much lately. Work is really heating up, and I spend a lot of time during my day on the computer writing reports and whatnot, and I just haven't had the energy for it, so I apologize. But believe me, I do read everything. I try to respond to everything as timely as possible. I'll try to get better with that. Hopefully, summer's approaching, so once summer comes, I'll be a lot more responsive. But there's only, unfortunately, so much time in my day, and I have to kind of prioritize what I'm going to do. And unfortunately, it hasn't been Facebook. But anyway, thanks so much for listening. We'll catch you guys all next time.